Funding for Idaho Reports is provided by the Friends of 4, 10, and 12, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by a grant from the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation.
The grasshoppers come in from the desert and just move into the fields as soon as the desert dries out. As long as the desert's green, they stay out there and eat, but as soon as the desert starts drying out, they come into the fields where the green crops are.
A southern Idaho grasshopper invasion could cost the state over $1 billion in crop losses. We'll look at that story tonight. Good evening. State and federal officials in Idaho and Washington, D.C. had thought that today was the day a decision would be reached on whether the federal government would free up the money needed for a massive spraying of southern Idaho to end a grasshopper invasion. But that word did not come today from the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C. An aide to Idaho Republican Senator James McClure did say late this afternoon that the request by the senator for federal aid, quote, seems to be going our way now, end quote. But the aide said he did not know how much money could be allocated for spraying in Idaho or how soon that decision would come. It could possibly come now tomorrow. Last week, the senator requested $10 million for spraying in Idaho, and Governor John Evans declared the state a disaster area due to the worst grasshopper infestation in several years. Tonight, we'll look at the extent of the damage wrought by the grasshoppers so far, what can be done now to cut the losses, and who, if anyone, is to blame for this grasshopper plague. Producer Gary Richardson was in Elmore County today, one of the hardest hit areas in southern Idaho. Here's his report.
All there is stems left there, and if you leave it long enough, as you can see out here in front, they'll eventually even get the stems as they run out of soft, tender leaves. And it continues out into the field even more so. There's leaves out in the middle, but there are also millions of grasshoppers working out in there ahead of the crew that's cleaning up, it seems like, here behind. There's always the new ones coming in, and the first place they hit is the edge of the field. But the ones that are out in the lead, they're still way out in the fields just doing nothing but eating. And pretty quick, the whole place will look like this, and pretty soon, it'll even look like this, where there's nothing. Even the stems are gone.
We're terribly concerned about the economy and what it's going to do to our production this fall. And we've had some tragic problems with farmers being foreclosed upon and going through bankruptcy and this type of thing, and I don't think Idaho can stand much more of this.
As you can see here, this land will very soonly be bare, all in this area and back how far, who knows. And the grasshoppers migrate from over the fences. You can see them coming across there in herds right now from the BLM ground. And when the wind blows, these grasshoppers ride in on the wind, and it looks like a heavy snowstorm sometimes as they come in on the winds. And they all seem to be landing pretty much in your fields. Where the grasshoppers have been working on the sides of our bean fields here, it's from right here at the point of standing to approximately 75 to 80 feet. Out where there was beans here, there are none, not even stems left right here. They just eat it right to the ground. You can see what's left of beans around the edge of the field, just these little dry stems. They're dried up, and there's places like this, there's not even any stems left. They eat them right completely into the ground. As you can see up the road, nothing but little dry, look like just little dry matchsticks running up through there. It's about all that's left.
In biblical times, such disasters were attributed to the supernatural. Moses, attempting to free his people, called down a plague of grasshoppers or locusts on Egypt. Idaho farmers have a less mystical way of ascribing blame. They see the hand of federal land managers in the problem.
I really think that the BLM, I think the federal government should assume some responsibility for this. And I feel that if the situation was reversed, they would probably quarantine our land and insist that we take action. And so this is where we're going for help. We are saying that they belong to the federal government. They're federal government grasshoppers.
What we expect them to do is take care of the ones that keep coming in. If we could kill the ones in our place and they could kill the ones on the government ground, we figure we could handle this thing.
Where do you place the blame?
On the BLM ground. That's where they're coming from, is out of the desert. So they're grasshoppers and moving in on us.
What about timing? Is it too late to spray now?
Well, I don't really think it'd be too late if they could get on it this week and get the spraying done in the desert to stop the migration of them coming into the fields, the ones that are left in the desert. I think that would, say, like Woody says, then we can spray our fields and should eliminate them.
Actually, I feel that they should stand a couple of sprayings on our fields, and we've already been a spraying. I have one field I've sprayed 3 times, and if they don't do something very soon, we're all going to have to just spray every week, which we absolutely cannot afford. It's just to the point of can we or can't we?
I mentioned earlier Idaho Governor John Evans issued a disaster declaration last week. The governor was sharply critical of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Agriculture Secretary John Block, and the Reagan administration for lack of quick action in dealing with the grasshopper invasion. The governor called the situation, and I quote, a natural disaster born in Washington, D.C. Mike Brush is an aide to the governor who's been coordinating the state's fights against the insects. First, Mr. Brush, do you agree with that McClure aide who I quoted earlier as saying that things seem to be going the state's way now and getting some money to spray these insects?
Mark, I'm very pleased to hear that. We initially made a request almost 3 weeks ago to Secretary Block. Even though our principal concern at this point is public lands, are the public lands which are operated and managed by the Bureau of Land Management, up until just recently. The contract to provide pest control on those Bureau of Land Management lands was through a U.S. Department of Agriculture organization whose acronym is APHIS, the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service. This APHIS organization had the contract and abruptly notified BLM that it was no longer going to be able to provide assistance this year. That was a matter of weeks ago. Our state BLM district office, of course, was left in a situation where it had a major infestation of grasshoppers on public range, which was moving at that time to privately owned land. And they had no means, no funds in which to combat this plague. The governor was most alarmed, upset. He still is. And he is going to continue pushing the federal government until they take responsibility for this problem. As you saw from particularly Woody's comments, there are individual farmers who are facing a complete economic disaster this year. If you look at the total cost to Idahoans, and Idaho's #1 industry, agriculture, loss of tax revenues due to loss of profits, cost to the federal government of programs which will come into effect after this disaster is declared by Secretary Block, it would have been far more economical on the part of the federal government to adequately fund a pest prevention program in the first place and keep the problem on those public lands. So we're most disturbed. We're most disturbed. We're pleased, though, that perhaps some action is finally being taken.
We were under the impression, I think lots of folks were, as long ago as last Thursday or Friday, that a decision would come today. Why no decision today, do you know?
I don't know. As I stated earlier, some 3 weeks ago, we made a request for assistance. To this date, we have received no correspondence from Secretary Block.
How do you explain that?
I have no explanation.
So the governor has written the Secretary of Agriculture, but he hasn't even answered his letter.
That's correct.
The governor said, and I quoted him a moment ago, as saying that this was a natural disaster born in Washington, D.C. What exactly did he mean by that, other than these sort of overlapping, conflicting agencies that have to deal with this problem?
Our concern early on was that the source of the infestation was federally owned public lands. Grasshoppers don't come from cultivated land. They come rather from uncultivated land. In Idaho, 42% of our state is owned by the Bureau of Land Management. That particular fact, coupled with the fact that there was a late, unusually late spring, cold, wet spring, combined to produce a lot of grasshoppers. Those grasshoppers fed on that public range until it began to heat up and the range dried out. And then they looked around for the nearest available green feed, which just happened to be the main farm belt in the state of Idaho. Our concern was that the reason why the infestation wasn't controlled on those public lands was because of budget cutbacks in Washington, D.C. The costs of fighting this infestation were essentially magnified and transferred to the private sector.
Budget cuts solely the responsibility of the Reagan administration?
That's
or-
correct.
I read today, though, that the last time there'd been spraying was 1979, right?
That's
Back
correct.
during the Carter administration.
That's correct. The APHIS program has gone through a series of cuts in its program, and that is the principal organization that had provided pest control on both Forest Service and BLM land. And when those budgets were adversely impacted, those private landowners who owned land near to federally owned public lands were adversely affected. We're concerned, we're very concerned that if this is evidence of a long-range policy of this administration, that potentially Idaho has very much to lose economically. Our state is major industry is agriculture. Most of that industry lies nearby or is contiguous to public lands in one form or another. And if the federal government is embarked on a policy of eliminating its program to control pests on its public lands, that is of great concern to this state, to our economy.
We'll come back, sir. Thank you. You've already heard a number of criticisms of the way the federal government has managed this, and particularly in Idaho, the Federal Bureau of Land Management. The BLM's view now from Larry Woodard, the Associate State Director in Idaho for the BLM. How about Mr. Brush's point about the policy decision to eliminate these kinds of programs? Is his concern justified, Mr. Woodard?
I believe it is. When we became aware through the APHIS officials that were conducting their normal surveys of pests on public lands and advised us in early July that a potential problem was arising, we were also told about the same time that they had little capability to provide the normal services that they have in years past. You mentioned 1979, I believe also in 72. So immediately we realized that we had a growing infestation, and our principal agent that had been doing that kind of work for us in the past was not able to perform adequately. I'm sure they're embarrassed as we are, but the only action that we have taken to date, besides encouraging that funds be made available to combat this, is that we did give authorization to our district managers throughout southern Idaho to allow private farmers to spray adjacent public lands if they felt this was necessary to control the migration of grasshoppers off these desert rangelands onto their cultivated fields.
But I would assume as a practical matter, as one of those farmers indicated on videotape, that's a pretty expensive proposition.
It is, and but that was one positive step that we thought we could allow, and some farmers have taken advantage of that. And but that is not the solution to the long-range problem.
Is Senator Weatherall right when she says these are federal government grasshoppers then?
There's no question that they breed and start out on primarily dry desert lands, and those are in southern Idaho largely public lands administered by the Bureau of Land Management.
What can you tell me about why this program was cut back or eliminated?
I have no idea. It's in the Department of Agriculture, and until this crisis hit, you know, it was the first time we locally were aware that our principal agent to control pests of this nature was in such dire financial straits.
Senator McClure's press secretary, Bill Livingston, told our producer, Gary Richardson, today that the senator was really upset by this situation, and so upset that he said, and I quote, that the federal government likes to own land, but they don't like to take care of it. Is that part of the problem here, Mr. Woodard?
We think we're doing a pretty good job of managing lands, but you know, Congress is the one that sets our budget levels and also provides us with a direction as to how they want these lands managed. And historically, because of the expertise that APHIS has had, the federal government through Congress has always looked to them to combat these types of outbreaks. And now we find ourselves in a situation that budget cuts have put them in an awkward position, and I'm sure that's why we're experiencing a delay today as to whether funding will be available to actually address grasshoppers this year in Idaho.
So the delay is really due not to what we might think of as just the process of filling out the proper forms and getting the bureaucracy cranked up. It's really a question of a policy choice on the part of the administration.
That's right, and everybody waiting, where's the money coming from, and when's it going to be released, if at all?
Well, let me just go back quickly to Mr. Brush on that point. Is that your view of this, Mr. Brush, that it's a policy question? It's not a matter of cranking up the bureaucracy to find this money. It's a matter of making a policy decision, whether to spend the money.
Congress has passed appropriate legislation enabling an agency to deal with this kind of problem. What is not there is the budget for that agency to work. What is also not there is a commitment, I feel, by this administration to support such an agency. It's my understanding, and I'm sure Leland can address it a little bit more with better numbers than mine, but that the Reagan administration doesn't support APHIS. Public lands pest management is largely a Western issue, and because of that, there are some concerns regarding that. In all fairness, too, to BLM and the state representatives to BLM, they are as much a victim, although I don't want to put them in the same context as Woody, who was pointing to his bean field here earlier, but they're as much a victim of this circumstance as Idahoans are. They were unaware until just a few weeks ago that there was going to be no pest control program in this state. And so they were essentially caught holding the bag.
We'll come back, gentlemen. Thank you. Our final look at the grasshopper invasion tonight comes from Leland Fife, an administrator with the Idaho Department of Agriculture. He's got some of the numbers to tell us just how extensive this problem is. What can you tell us about the extent of the problem? We've heard lots of figures bandied around. I used the figure of $1.2 billion in crop losses. Try to sketch in some parameters of just what we're talking about here.
Mark, that $1.1 billion of that's been floating around here, that's an estimation of the total value of the field crops in the South Idaho. And it's my opinion that that crop is not going to be devastated by grasshoppers. It's true. In certain areas, on certain farms, there is going to be a tremendous amount of damage. But because of the lateness of the season, it certainly is not going to wipe out $1.1 billion worth of crops.
So what are we talking about? Maybe
it's
several million, hundred million?
It'll run into the millions, no doubt. But it's real hard to get a handle on this. This grasshopper infestation is general throughout the rangeland of South Idaho.
So from the Wyoming border to the Oregon border, we've got grasshoppers, and from Nevada to how far north?
Well, up to Adams County, including Adams County.
Okay.
Pretty much south of the Salmon River to the Nevada border is infested at amounts that normally you would spray to control the hoppers.
Now, I heard today that there are some areas, in some cultivated areas, there are so many grasshoppers that you just can't count them by, you measure them by the square yard, I think. Is that right?
Well, that's true. When grasshoppers reach 25 to 35 per square yard, it's pretty difficult to get a real accurate count. But once they have surpassed the economic threshold, which is 8 grasshoppers per square yard, then you in effect stop counting. There's infestation, and it's heavy, and it's going to cause some damage, especially to farms that are adjacent to BLM land. Now, there's one thing that's happening, and that is the fact that the grasshoppers are several weeks later than normal. Usually by the 20th of July, if there's going to be any spray program conducted, it's all over with. It was the 10th of July before we were even notified that there was a potential problem.
I see. Well, does that give us some extra time then? Should some money come through to spray grasshoppers to deal with the problem? Is there enough time left?
The time is running out. In some areas, the adult population is approaching 90% adults. And the experts in this field say that when the adult population reaches 50%, spray is somewhat questionable. Sure, we can get results. We can kill grasshoppers if they were sprayed this week. But the real effect would be diminished because of the lateness of the application.
Okay, just one more question about the sort of the technical aspects here. It's been suggested that there are maybe 4.5 million acres infested one way or the other by grasshoppers. How much of that would need to be sprayed in order to be effective, even as effective as it could be at this late a date?
I don't think it's feasible to spray 4.5 million acres at this time. I don't think it's physically possible to spray that many acres. We worked up a sort of a border protection program last week that encompassed about 500,000 acres. And we thought that if we could spray those acres twice, that we could give fair protection. But at this time, regardless of what we do, we are not going to control the problem. We will affect it somewhat, but to give control, a complete control, it's just out of the picture. It's too late, too little, too late.
Okay, well on that point, let me open it up and go back to Mr. Brush. You agree with that?
I think so. I have to say, though, that I'm pleased that there is some action being taken. We requested action some 3 weeks ago, and I'm pleased that those decisions are about to be made. We're most concerned. We just cannot, as a state, risk our principal industry to this sort of pest on any kind of a basis. The costs are tremendous. Not the least of which is when you look at Woody on the film, and having spoke with him just last Friday night, to understand that what we're talking about is wiping a small businessman out. And he handled himself very well, and having spoken with him personally and seeing the anguish and the emotional context and the problems that he is having in dealing with this issue and trying to understand where the help is coming from, to me, I'm pleased to see some action taken. Well, I'm not sure, though, that action comes any too soon.
Yeah, Mr. Woodard, do you have a view of that? Is it too late?
I think the window that we had to control this current crop of grasshoppers is closing very rapidly, and I agree with Leland that we're getting down to the ragged edges of a viable spraying program. But he points up an issue that I think we ought to be aware of as a state, and that is that grasshoppers are cyclic. We're starting to see a cycle grow now, and we're even more concerned about what is a large population this year, the effects of them raising another brood this next spring.
Would spraying affect that, even if it came at this late date?
That's what we're concerned about. I think it's apt to have minimal effect for the crop next year, and so if anything, we ought to be gearing up for the 85 spraying program.
That's your view,
Mark,
Mr. Fite?
I would like to make this point. When grasshoppers mature, they seem to be more interested in mating and laying eggs than they are in foraging. They do eat. I'm not saying that they don't. But you see hundreds of grasshoppers out there, and in some fields, they're really not causing a lot of damage to the crop. In some other areas they are, like Woody's field. I have no doubt but what he is suffering severe losses. But once they reach adult and they mate, you do not break the
you don't break the cycle.
The cycle.
No, okay.
The eggs are already there, and the potential for next year is great And I think this is a greater issue that we should be looking to next year. And it seems to me that if the government could indemnify the farmers that are having the problem, that this might be cheaper than trying to spend millions of dollars in control at this point, because it's spotty. In the areas that they're moving in to the cropland, they are causing tremendous damage. But there are other areas that they've sort of moved in, they're all adults, or 90% adults in many areas, and according to Dr. Pollard, who is with APHIS, it seems to be his opinion that the most of the damage has already taken place.
Right. We invited him to be on the program tonight, and the grasshoppers unfortunately kept him in Twin Falls today. But let me just raise the question with Mr. Brush here about if it would not be better, considering all of this discussion, to just say, okay, we've lost what we've lost already. Maybe we ought to save whatever money there is going to be available and take a run at it again next year.
Well, I think there's a good possibility that we're going to have a problem next year, too. But I think, on the other hand, I don't think we just write off the problem this year either. I think we have a responsibility to do what we can to mitigate the losses this year. I think, though, that the issues raised earlier, in particular about the decision regarding policy, are critical and need to be made this year. I think those farmers need to be able to plan for next year's crop, to know that they're going to enjoy a certain degree of security in being able to get that crop out and to make a profit. And I think it's critical that we do what we can now, and that we set a policy for dealing with the problem next year as well.
Just finally, gentlemen, are we looking at some of these farmers and believing Mr. Fife when he says that there are areas that are particularly hard hit and some areas that aren't so bad? Are we looking at a make or break situation for some farmers? Is this going to drive some of them out of business, Mr. Brush?
Clearly.
No doubt about that.
If you looked at what's happened over the past 4 years and realized that the farm industry is a capital-intensive industry, that it relies from year to year on financing and frankly from year to year on how high the interest rates are.
Could the farmers sue somebody, as some of them are talking about?
That's possible.
Federal
our legal people indicate that is possible.
Mr. Fife, you just in a word agree that some farmers could be out of business because of this?
Oh yes, I definitely I believe this is true. It costs $4 to $7 an acre to spray their land. More than one application is necessary, and you know they get to a point to where they say, hey, you know, how many times can I afford to do this?
Right. I'm afraid I'm going to have to interrupt you there. We're out of time, unfortunately. Mr. Fife, Mr. Woodard, and Mr. Brush, we thank you, gentlemen, for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Mark.
That's our time for tonight. We'll be back here tomorrow. I'm Mark Johnson. Good night.
Funding for Idaho Reports is provided by the Friends of 4, 10, and 12, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by a grant from the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation.